Welcome to Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
I'm Albert Berg, and I have a bad idea for y'all today that, I'm not gonna lie, has me a little nervous. I'm confident in my presentation, Tony, and my facts. However, I know how this particular person is viewed on the internet, and I'm fully expecting some negative feedback from some fans of this gentleman, whose name is Nikola Tesla.
You mean internet deity Nikola Tesla?
Yeah, no, the science wizard.
And also, we're gonna say right now that we're not diminishing the great things that he did. There were just a few bad ideas that he had. So we know that Tesla did help change the world and change electricity and gave us a lot of what we have in the modern world. But he did have a couple that didn't quite pan out.
Yes, and so having gotten that caveat out of the way, that I know some of y'all are just not going to listen to the possibility that Tesla could have ever been wrong about anything, we're going to talk about what Tesla was wrong about, Tony. Tesla, in our day, is probably best known as being a promoter and popularizer and expander of alternating current. But if you know anything else about him, you probably know that he had another big project that he was working on for most of his life. And this idea that he had was that he wanted to build a power plant that would send out electricity and also information, he believed, through the crust of the earth, through the actual physical substance that the earth is made of. He thought that he could add power to the earth and then extract it at any distance that he particularly felt like doing away from the power plants, and it would be available.
And how far did he get along with that?
Well, we'll talk about that as we get further. But to go further into the theory, Tesla believed that there was a stationary electric wave that was bound up in the crust of the earth, and that if he could tap into that wave, he could transmit electricity freely over the surface of the globe. And he further believed that the electrical circuit would be completed by the electricity sent out through the Earth's surface, returning to the plant from whence it originated through the thinner air in the upper atmosphere. And this is a fun fact that almost nobody ever talks about with Nikola Tesla, but when they're talking about this particular idea, Tesla thought that this process of the energy completing the circuit and coming back to the plant through the upper atmosphere would mean that essentially nighttime would be gone. That this would fluoresce the upper atmosphere in the same way that fluorescent bulbs work because they have electricity flowing through them and they create light. He thought that this would light up the upper atmosphere and there just wouldn't be dark anymore.
I wonder what that would do to human circadian rhythms.
It probably wouldn't be great. In order to bring this idea to fruition, in 1899, Tesla goes to Colorado Springs. And while he's there, he builds the largest Tesla coil ever constructed up until that point. And he's set to work proving to himself that this idea that he has about transmitting energy through the surface of the earth is a good idea. His system used so much energy that it could only be operated at night. And even then, on several occasions, it overloaded the early power plants that were providing electricity to the town nearby. The Tesla coil that he used produced jolts of electricity so powerful that thunderbolts were heard over 10 miles from the source. And his system lit a trio of light bulbs 60 feet away from the transmission point.
I mean, if all you got to do is have like constant thunder to get those light bulbs lit, that's not too bad.
Yeah, in reading about this, I saw somebody mention that people freak out about having cell phones next to their ear these days and how that might be a bad idea, and just hypothesizing that maybe people wouldn't be cool with having a massive energy spewing plant right next to them, even if this had worked out.
I mean, who's really talking on cell phones all that often much anymore?
Well, that's fair. We're just going to get hand cancer now.
Yeah, we'll get like cancer of the thumbs.
It's important to understand what Tesla was doing in Colorado. He knew his idea was the right idea. He believed that it would work before he ever got to Colorado. He wasn't in Colorado to test this idea. He was there to prove this idea. And so when his electrical transmission system that burned out the power plant nearby and could only be run at night because it would drain all of the other energy from the grid that the town was using, only sent energy 60 feet to these light bulbs that he wanted to light up, it didn't bother him. He wasn't concerned by this, what you might call limitation of this power plant. He thought, listen, this proves the principle. This is going to work. As long as I can fine tune it, I just got to get bigger, better transformers and more power generation. And the global power transmission system is definitely going to be a thing. Tesla also had another real good reason to be optimistic. Because while he was in Colorado, another inventor named Marconi had proved that the transmission of information, at least, was possible over very long distances, longer than was previously thought possible. And Marconi's device used a Tesla coil. And on top of that, if you looked at the schematics, it had to be grounded to the earth. And if you're Nikola Tesla, you look at this fact and you say, you're using my Tesla coil, you're pumping electricity into the earth, you're sending your messages way far along, it's gotta be the same thing that I'm working on, okay? He goes so far as to accuse Marconi of patent infringement. He says in one of his many articles that he writes about popular science and electricity that Marconi's device probably used as many as 17 of his patents, a claim that was never actually backed up, partly because, as we'll see, Tesla didn't fully understand what Marconi was doing, but he assumes that Marconi is stealing his idea. So he rushes back home to New York and begins rounding up funding for his thing, and in 1901, he manages to purchase a piece of land in Shoreham, New York, and begins building an even larger model of his experimental power transmission plant. Tesla was understandably very secretive about this project, so we don't know as much as we might like to about his plans, but we do know that the power itself reached 186 feet tall, and that Tesla sunk an electrical conduit over 120 feet down into the earth. Unfortunately, right when Tesla was starting his project, the stock market crashed. And while Tesla would continue work on the tower until 1917, he eventually had to abandon his dream.
I imagine whenever you're the only one working on it, or at least one of very, very few people, it's going to take so much time and effort, and if he would have actually had some other people helping him with it, he might have been able to get it done before the crash happened.
He wasn't working completely alone. He had some architects that were mentioned in several of the things that I was reading, and I assumed that there were construction workers that were building it looked like a power plant with a giant tower sticking out the top of it, Tony. He did not lay all the bricks and do all the work himself, but he was keeping the principles of the thing under wraps.
Yeah, and that's more what I meant with the with the development, like other scientists and things like that.
Yes. And that gets into an interesting point and really where we're going with this, because a lot of people like to think that Tesla was this visionary who was axed by the big power commercial interests, right? That he had this plan to produce free power for everybody, and Westinghouse or somebody saw that and said, you ain't making no money off of this thing, so we're just going to axe this idea. And if he could have just gotten it up and running, everything would have been hunky-dory and the utopia would have been ushered in and everybody would have free power. And the sad truth is that Tesla's idea never would have worked. Whether or not he had the money to continue as far as he wanted to, it would not have produced the results that he wanted to produce, and here is why. Tesla didn't understand radio. Now, that might come as a shock to many of Tesla's modern day fans, because one of the narratives that's developed over the years is that Tesla was the quote-unquote true inventor of radio, and that Marconi essentially stole his ideas and took credit for them. And
it's not even recognized by Congress now that Tesla was the inventor of the radio.
No, there was a court case that is misquoted about like patents and actually somebody else who's not sort of ancillarily related to Tesla. I read up on this particular part of the story and did not include all the details, but it's quoted as being that this court case was thrown to Tesla and that he was the true inventor of radio, but it's not. If you read the actual court case, that's not what it's saying.
And that one went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court from what I'm reading right now.
Yes. The reason that I know that Tesla wasn't the quote-unquote inventor of real radio is because Tesla was of the opinion that Marconi didn't understand the science behind what he was doing. Tesla claimed that his device was the true wireless, and his device for transmission was this idea that the Earth would conduct electricity well enough to be able to transmit power and, again, information all over the world. And we can look at Tesla's own writing and prove that he didn't understand the principles behind the radio. To understand the context of this argument, it's important to understand that the very existence of radio waves was a very recently proven phenomenon. They had been predicted to exist by the Scottish mathematician James Clerk Maxwell in 1867, and they had only been experimentally verified in 1887 by German physicist Heinrich Hertz. Even then, these quote-unquote Hertzian waves were at best considered an oddity of physics. There was no sense that some practical application could be made of the phenomenon, because if these waves were analogous to light, scientists said, they would only ever be useful for signaling within line of sight. Hertz himself said of his discovery of radio waves, quote, "It's of no use whatsoever. This is just an experiment that proves Maestro Maxwell was right. We just have these mysterious electromagnetic waves that we cannot see with the naked eye, but they are there." End quote. And when asked what his discovery meant for the world at large, Hertz replied, quote, "Nothing, I guess," unquote.
And I'm guessing like the electrical term Hertz is based off of this guy's research?
That's correct.
Okay. I didn't know if there was a previous Hertz or not.
No, that's him. So when Tesla hears these tales of Marconi transmitting information over much longer distances than were previously believed possible using a Tesla coil and a connection to the ground, again, don't forget, to Tesla, these are all hugely important because his device uses these two things as well. It was perfectly obvious to him that these newfangled Hertzian radio waves had nothing to do with it, and that Marconi was secretly or maybe accidentally using the ground transmission system that Tesla himself had devised. Even before Marconi had come onto the scene, Tesla had doubts about Hertz and his findings. So much so that in 1882, Tesla traveled to Bern, Germany to try to convince the physicist that what he was witnessing was not radio waves, but rather the natural conductance of the atmosphere, and left very disappointed when Hertz could not be convinced of his point of view. Tesla would cling to this radio skepticism at least until 1919, when he published a paper called The True Wireless, that was nothing short of a hit piece on all things Hertzian and a redoubled defense of Tesla's own theory of planetary transmission. He even brought up Hertz's own quote to his defense, writing, quote, "When Dr. Hertz was asked whether such a system would be of practical value, he did not think so, and he was correct in his forecast." Unquote. Hertz's doubts about the practical value of radio waves might have made some sense when he first voiced them, but by the time Tesla referenced them in 1919, it had been 10 years since Marconi's radio telegraph had been used to call for help from the sinking Titanic. And within 3 years of his writing, the British would launch the British Broadcasting Corporation.
So even after they had radios, even after these were fully proven technologies, he still was against it.
I think what is happening here is that Tesla would say, well, that Titanic thing, they weren't that far away. He might have said the ocean was actually conducting this. The larger problem here is that Tesla cannot conceive of electromagnetic waves in the way that they actually are. He's still thinking in terms of electrical current. In his mind, these electromagnetic waves, if they're functioning at all in the way that they seem to be functioning for Marconi, Marconi must be having current pass through the air in the same way that current passes through a wire or that it passes through gas in a tube. And that's not how electromagnetic waves work. Again, this is not a diss on Tesla to say that he's dumb or whatever, but he's coming up with a certain understanding of science, and this new information just does not get processed in the correct way. He doesn't add it to his repertoire in a fully honest and open way. So he's probably coming up with other explanations for why he thinks the radio would work. And he's just having confirmation bias, which is ultimately the bad idea in this episode of Bad Ideas. And you might ask, what about those light bulbs that he lit up 60 feet from his experimental station in Colorado? And you would be correct in saying that Tesla was not completely wrong. The Earth can kind of conduct some electricity, but the resistance is ridiculously high. Tesla's conception of this, as far as I can understand, is essentially if you have a real big bowl of water, you can add some water to that bowl and then it'll spill out on the other side somewhere. If you have a tap set up, you would be able to harness that, and that the Earth was essentially a big old bowl of electricity that you could pump some into and then later get some out of from a different place. And it is not anywhere near that simple. The resistance and essentially the electrical friction that is created within the Earth's crust just does not make this a workable theory.
Yeah, and maybe it would work better in certain areas, like if you're out on a salt flat or something like that, maybe, but
right. But it's not
really in like a general sense.
Yeah, it's not nearly as good as just like sending the electricity through some wires. As annoying as it might have to be to set up a bunch of wires on a bunch of poles, that's way easier than trying to conduct them through the entire surface of the globe.
Confirmation bias isn't a thing that only hit Tesla either. Like, we're going to be talking about Edison next week and his denial of AC power in general and how much he didn't want that to become a thing.
Yeah, those of you who are really mad at me about Tesla, just hang on till next week. Tony's got an episode about, well, dunk on old bad Edison too. That I'm not a fan of that narrative, by the way. I do like Tesla, and I've since I was a child, I have come to understand that Edison was not the paragon of intelligence that I first believed he was, but I think both men were flawed and both men produced a lot of really great stuff. And I don't believe in the like Tesla got Edison good or vice versa. Edison got Tesla good.
There's a little bit of it there. There's definitely some bad business and some unethical things that have happened, but it's not quite as sensational as we'd like it to be.
And the biggest bad idea that Tesla had was in his experiments. He was doing all of these experiments to prove to himself that what he was saying would work. He never did an experiment to disprove what he wanted to find. And it's a tough thing when you're excited about an idea to say, okay, what's the experiment that will prove this wrong? And you got to cut Tesla a little bit of slack because we're still in the very early days of this kind of science. I'm not saying he was a big dummy. I'm not saying that he didn't do anything great, because he did really contribute to the early days of AC, but he was not the perfect, infallible science wizard that popular culture would like to make him out to be. He was susceptible to the same mental traps that we all are, and that is why his power transmission plan failed.
Yeah, it's a shame, because I feel like if he would have understood, he could have put a lot of that energy into some other really cool projects.
It could have been interesting. I wonder what it would have taken for him to let go of this understanding of the world. When you grow up, when you have a formative experience, and he really, I think, got to a point where he intuitively understood current. He understood the ways that current moved and the principles of inductions and the principles of magnetism, and he never found a way to apply that mental model and break free of that mental model that did serve him really well when he was developing AC. He never found a way to make room in that model for radio waves. And maybe he did later in life. Maybe eventually he figured out what he had done wrong, but I was not able to find any writing that indicated that.
Anyway, thank you all for listening to Bad Ideas this week. We will be back next week talking about Edison and his dispute with AC power. And if you enjoyed this, please check out our Patreon, patreon.com/humanechoes. Become a member starting at $2 a month. Helps us out a ton. Also, if you enjoyed this, check out our YouTube channel, youtube.com/humanechoes for a lot of cool gaming content and other cool stuff.
We'll see you guys next week.
Bye.